On March 12, 1938, when the German troops crossed the Austrian border in what would be known as the Anschluss, one of the first objectives was not a military installation nor a government headquarters. It was the Hofburg Palace Museum in Vienna. There, guarded among the jewels of the former Habsburg Empire, rested a 30-centimeter spear tip, broken in two and joined by a silver and gold sheath. For Adolf Hitler, that object was worth more than any arsenal. What drove the leaders of the Third Reich was not only territorial ambition. Behind the most feared military apparatus of the 20th century, there was a parallel obsession: the search for sacred objects, ancient relics, and artifacts of supernatural power. Heinrich Himmler, Reichsführer of the SS, founded in 1935 the Ahnenerbe, a pseudoscientific organization that came to employ 137 academics and 82 support workers. Its expeditions reached the Himalayas, Tibet, Bolivia, Greece, Finland, and North Africa. Its official mission was to study the Aryan past. Its real mission was to find what no conventional army could conquer: the power of the supernatural. When the Reich collapsed in May 1945, those objects did not disappear with it. Some were recovered by the Allies, others fell into the hands of private collectors, several were hidden in mountain tunnels or basements of destroyed churches, and a few remain unaccounted for. The Spear of Destiny, the object Hitler needed to possess. There is a precise moment in history that defines obsession. In August 1938, 5 months after the Anschluss, Adolf Hitler asked the Nuremberg City Hall to submit an official petition to the Austrian government claiming the restitution of the Holy Lance and the rest of the imperial Habsburg treasure. It was not a diplomatic request. It was an order wrapped in bureaucratic formality. On August 29, 1938, an armored train guarded by SS troops left Vienna for Nuremberg. On board was the tip of a 30-centimeter spear, broken in two and joined by a silver and gold sheath, with two small gold crosses on the handle, and, added in the 13th century, one of the supposed nails of the crucifixion embedded in the central channel of the tip. The object was the so-called Spear of Longinus, also known as the Spear of Destiny, the Holy Lance, or Heilige Lanze. According to Christian tradition, it was the weapon with which the Roman soldier Longinus, or Gaius Cassius Longinus according to later versions, pierced the side of Jesus on the cross at Golgotha, an episode narrated only in the Gospel of John. The apocryphal Gospel of Nicodemus, dated in the 4th century, was the first to name the soldier. It was also the first to transform a routine act of execution into the origin of a relic that would change hands between emperors, kings, and conquerors for 17 centuries. The list of those who supposedly possessed it is long enough to build an alternative history of Europe. Constantine the Great is said to have used it as a talisman in the Battle of the Milvian Bridge in 312. Emperor Theodosius is said to have used it against the Goths. Medieval chronicles attribute it to Charlemagne, Henry the Fowler, King of Saxony and a nearly mystical figure of veneration for Himmler, and Frederick Barbarossa, who supposedly dropped it in a river while crossing a river in Italy in 1190, drowning shortly after. In 1796, when Napoleon was advancing on Nuremberg, the city authorities evacuated the treasure to Vienna. Baron von Hugel, who guarded the objects, sold them to the House of Habsburg. Since then, the spear rested in the Hofburg Palace. Hitler first saw it there during his youth in Vienna, when he still dreamed of becoming a painter and didn't yet know that the Academy of Fine Arts would reject him twice. It was a visit that, according to later accounts, marked him for life. In Mein Kampf, published in 1925, he wrote that the imperial jewels in Vienna seemed to act as magical relics rather than the visible guarantee of an eternal bond. When he came to power in 1933 and carried out the annexation of Austria in 1938, recovering the spear became a priority that tolerated no delays. The armored train that arrived in Nuremberg deposited the treasure in the crypt of St. Catherine's Church. It remained there for most of the war. But Allied bombings systematically destroyed the city. St. Catherine's was reduced to ruins. In 1944, with the air raids intensifying, the objects were moved to a reinforced chamber within a network of tunnels dug beneath the ancient medieval fortress of Nuremberg, known as the Kaiserburg. The entrance was hidden behind a false wall in the garage of a civilian house. When a bomb destroyed that house, the armored doors were exposed to anyone passing by. Part of the treasure was then moved to the basement of a nearby school. The Reich's administrative chaos in its final weeks was complete. The spear was found on April 30th, 1945, by intelligence officers of the 7th Army of the United States during the systematic search for the imperial treasure ordered by the Allied High Command. The date was no coincidence, and historians did not overlook it. On that same day, in his bunker beneath the Reich Chancellery in Berlin, Adolf Hitler shot himself in the right temple as the Red Army completed the capture of the city. After the fall of the Third Reich, the Allies decided to return the Habsburg treasure to Vienna. The spear returned to the Hofburg Palace, where it remains on display today in room 11 of the Imperial Treasury. Forensic analysis conducted in 2003 by Australian scientist Robert Feather determined that the metal tip dates back to approximately the 7th century AD, ruling it out as a relic from the time of the crucifixion. But that does not change what it represented for those who believed in it, nor the historical weight of the acts committed in its name. There are at least 4 spears in the world claimed to be the original. One in the Vatican, not displayed to the public, kept in one of the pillars of St. Peter's Basilica. One in Krakow, Poland, since the 13th century. One in the Armenian Cathedral of Echmiadzin, known as the Spear of Antioch. And the one in Vienna, the one Hitler stole, the one the Americans found, the one that today rests 30 meters from the place where it was first stored. The blood flag, the relic that consecrated the party. On November 9, 1923, at noon, a column of approximately 2,000 men marched through the streets of Munich toward the Bavarian Ministry of Defense. At the front were Adolf Hitler, General Erich Ludendorff, and several leaders of the nascent Nazi Party. At Odeonsplatz, Bavarian police blocked their way. The gunfire lasted less than a minute. When the smoke cleared, 16 of the coup plotters and 4 police officers were dead on the pavement. One of the flag bearers of the party, Heinrich Trambauer, was wounded. The fabric of the flag, which carried the swastika on a red background, was soaked with the blood of 3 of the fallen. Hitler was arrested and sentenced to 5 years in prison, of which he served less than 9 months in the Landsberg fortress. The flag was kept by party sympathizers during his imprisonment. Upon his release from prison in December 1924, Hitler recovered the flag, and something in his perception of the object had changed. From that moment on, the blood-stained cloth ceased to be a political flag and became the Blutfahne, the blood flag. Semantics mattered. It was no longer a symbol of the party, it was a relic. It was attributed with consecrating powers that no ordinary ritual could confer. The object was typically stored in the Brauner's House, the NSDAP headquarters in Munich on Brienner Strasse. It was not displayed as decoration. It was taken out for specific ceremonies with a sacramental logic that Himmler and the Nazi ceremonial team developed with almost liturgical precision. The protocol was as follows. At party gatherings, especially at the annual Nuremberg rallies, the flag bearers of the different sections of the SA and the SS had to bring their banners into physical contact with the Blutfahne in the presence of Hitler. The act was called Fahnenweihe, the consecration of flags. The person who held the Blutfahne during the ceremony was Jakob Grimminger, a veteran of the 1923 Putsch who retained this privilege throughout the existence of the Reich. He was a quiet, decorated man who understood exactly the symbolic weight of what he held in his hands. The Nuremberg ceremony gathered tens of thousands of participants at the Zeppelinfeld Field, the stadium designed by Albert Speer with seating for 340,000 people and a tribune that replicated, on an industrial scale, the altar of Pergamon. The moment of the Fahnenweihe was the climax of the ritual. Hitler advanced down the central aisle, the so-called Lichtdom, the Cathedral of Light, formed by 130 anti-aircraft projectors firing vertically into the night sky until he reached the Blutfahne and extended his hand over the new banners. The physical contact between the relic and the new symbols of the party was the transfer of sacred power. It was not metaphor. Participants experienced it as a real transmission. The American historian George Mossey documented how Nazism systematically built a political liturgy that imitated and competed with the structure of Christian ritual. Relics, sacred places, martyrs, ceremonies of consecration, and an eschatology of the final victory. The Blutfahne was the central object of this secular religious architecture. Its function was not to remember the failed putsch. It was to turn the defeat of 1923 into the mythical origin of a political resurrection. The failure of November was reinterpreted as the foundational sacrifice, the dead of Odeonsplatz as the first martyrs of the movement. During the years of the Reich, the Blutfahne was carefully guarded. There are no records of it being regularly photographed or allowed to be photographed in detail. The opacity was part of its power. What is not fully shown retains its aura better. When the Reich collapsed in May 1945, the Blutfahne disappeared. It was not found in the Brown House of Munich, which had been bombed and looted. It did not appear in any Allied inventory of objects seized from the party. Grimminger, its last known bearer, was arrested by US forces, tried and convicted in the denazification trials, but never provided any information about the flag's whereabouts. Since then, no investigation has been able to locate the object with certainty. There have been theories placing it buried in the gardens of the Brown House, moved to Argentina along with other party objects, or deliberately destroyed in the final days of the war to prevent it from falling into enemy hands. None have been verified. The Blutfahne remains 70 years later one of the most sought-after objects of Nazism and one of the most feared due to the implications its eventual appearance on the antiques market would have. The void it left is, in itself, eloquent. A relic whose power depended on collective belief has no existence without the system that upheld it. When the Third Reich died, the Blutfahne ceased to be a sacred object and became a piece of cloth with dry blood. Or that's what those who know what it would mean for it to fall into the wrong hands prefer to believe. The Shroud of Turin and the Nazis, the relic that hid itself. On September 8, 1939, a week after Germany invaded Poland and World War II began, a car left the Royal Palace of Turin heading for Rome. Inside, wrapped in cloth and placed in a wooden box, was one of the most controversial objects in the history of Christianity, the Shroud, the Holy Shroud of Turin. The House of Savoy, which kept the relic in the private chapel of their palace, had made the decision 2 weeks before the conflict expanded to Italy. Move the object before someone else did it for them. The concern was not abstract. The Nazis had a documented history of the systematic seizure of religious, artistic, and historical objects in all the territories they occupied. The Ahnenerbe and the SS had developed specific procedures for identifying and transferring objects of cultural and symbolic value. The spear from Vienna, recovered in 1938, was the most visible example. But behind this case was a much broader operation that, in the war years, would strip museums, churches, private collections, and Jewish communities of millions of pieces across Europe. The shroud was first taken to the Quirinal Palace in Rome, and then, on September 25, 1939, moved to the Benedictine Abbey of Montevergine, in the mountains of Avellino, about 60 kilometers east of Naples. The Benedictine monks received the object with precise instructions: protect it, do not speak of it, and under no circumstances reveal its location to anyone outside the monastery. The silent custody lasted 4 years without major complications. But in September 1943, the situation changed abruptly. German troops invaded northern and central Italy after the Italian armistice on September 8th. The SS began operating in territories that had been Reich allies only weeks earlier. Any symbolic object that had survived in Italian hands was now at immediate risk. On September 14, 1943, a group of German soldiers arrived at the Montevergine Abbey. They searched the rooms, inspected the premises, and entered the chapel where the shroud was kept. They did not find it. According to the testimony of the Benedictine Andrew Ripoll, who was interviewed decades later by writer Montserrat Rico Gongora at the time of the search, the monks were praying collectively around the altar, forming an involuntary human wall over the object's hiding place. The soldiers looked around, saw nothing out of the ordinary, and withdrew. It was an extreme case in which religious routine served as the best possible protection. The shroud had been hidden literally in plain sight, beneath the hands of those who were praying over it. After the war, the shroud was publicly displayed in October 1946 at the Montevergine Abbey before being returned to Turin, where it arrived in 1946. The Cardinal of Turin published a statement in November of that year in the Diocesan Turinese Journal, addressed to the faithful, in which he acknowledged that the decision to remove the shroud from Turin had been prudent, because although it had been respected by the bombs, it might not have been by the invader who hurried to inquire about it. That last sentence is the most revealing of all. He did not say that the Germans did not know about the shroud. He said they asked. Who asked, in what context, and with what intention is something that the Vatican archives and the records of the Abbey have not fully clarified. The question of whether the Nazis had a specific interest in the Holy Shroud is more complex than it seems. On one hand, the official ideology of Nazism was not favorable to Christianity. Himmler despised it for its Semitic origins, and the Ahnenerbe dedicated considerable efforts to discredit the Christian narrative of European origins. On the other hand, the search for objects with symbolic or supernatural power had no doctrinal limits in practice. If an object held influence over the mindset of the masses, it was a strategic resource regardless of its religious origin. What is certain is that the shroud survived the war intact. Today, it is kept in the Cathedral of St. John the Baptist in Turin. Radiocarbon analysis conducted in 1988 by laboratories in Oxford, Zurich, and Tucson dated the fabric between 1260 and 1390 AD, placing it in medieval Europe. Subsequent investigations have questioned this dating due to possible contamination of the sample. The scientific debate on its authenticity remains open, but what happened at the Montevergine Abbey on September 14, 1943, does not depend on that debate. It is documented history. And in that history, the most famous relic of Christianity was less than a meter away from the hands that sought to possess it. The Amber Room, the eighth wonder of the world that vanished in 36 hours. On October 14, 1941, a train departed from the Pushkin station on the outskirts of Leningrad, heading to Königsberg, the capital of the former East Prussia. On board were 27 wooden crates. Inside these crates were the amber panels, Florentine stone mosaics, carved mirrors and gold inlays that had, for nearly 200 years, made up the Amber Room of the Catherine Palace, which many considered the most extraordinary decorative wonder in Europe. The soldiers of the Wehrmacht's Northern Army Group dismantled it in 36 hours. The Amber Room was conceived in 1701 by the German Baroque sculptor Andreas Schlüter for the Charlottenburg Palace in Berlin, commissioned by King Frederick I of Prussia. The assembly work on the amber, a material that becomes extraordinarily fragile when dried, was completed by Danish craftsmen Gottfried Wolfram and later Gottfried Thurau and Ernst Schacht from Danzig. In 1716, King Frederick William I gifted it to Tsar Peter the Great of Russia as a diplomatic gesture to consolidate a strategic alliance. Peter installed it in the Winter Palace of St. Petersburg. In 1755, Empress Elizabeth moved it to the Catherine Palace in Tsarskoye Selo, where it was expanded and perfected, covering 55 square meters of wall surface with over 6 tons of Baltic amber backed with gold leaf. At the time of its theft, its value was estimated at over $140 million of the period. When the Wehrmacht advanced towards Leningrad in the summer of 1941, the curators of the Catherine Palace attempted to dismantle the room for evacuation. It was impossible. The amber, dried out over decades, disintegrated at the slightest touch. They tried to hide it by covering the panels with wallpaper. When the German Einsatzkommando soldiers arrived in September 1941, they found the room behind its poor disguise in a matter of minutes. The soldiers themselves dismantled some panels with the butts of their rifles, breaking amber that had survived for 200 years. Despite the vandalism, most of the room was packed into 27 crates and sent by rail to Königsberg, where the museum director of the castle, Alfred Rode, a specialist in Baltic amber, installed and publicly displayed it. On November 13, 1941, a Königsberg newspaper announced the exhibition. Hitler considered the Amber Room German property due to its Prussian origin, and its removal was part of the Reich's systematic policy to repatriate, or simply steal, cultural objects that the regime defined as part of the Aryan heritage. For 2 years, the room was on display in Königsberg. In 1943, with Allied bombers attacking the German cities in the east, Rode received instructions to dismantle and pack the room once again. The 27 crates were moved to the castle's basement. On August 26, 1944, the Royal Air Force bombed Königsberg in 2 waves that lasted 2 consecutive nights, destroying the historic center of the city. The castle suffered severe damage. In January 1945, with the Red Army advancing from the east, Hitler ordered the evacuation of the stolen objects from Königsberg. What happened to the crates of the Amber Room at that time is exactly what no one has been able to determine with certainty in 80 years. The last person to confirm having seen the crates was Alfred Rode himself on January 12, 1945. Months later, Rode died of typhus in December 1945, taking with him any additional information he might have had. Professor Alexander Brusov, the Soviet official responsible for recovering stolen objects in May 1945, inspected the ruins of the Königsberg Castle and found remnants of 3 of the 4 Florentine stone mosaics that had been part of the room, along with burnt metal hinges and fittings. His official conclusion, recorded in documents from the Russian National Archive, was that the Amber Room was destroyed between April 9th and 11th, 1945, during the final Battle of Königsberg. Amber has a melting point of between 200 and 380 degrees Celsius. An intense fire was enough to reduce it to ash, leaving no recognizable trace. However, the story did not end there. In 1997, German authorities recovered the fourth Florentine stone mosaic, which had been taken from the room during one of its relocations by a German soldier. It was in the possession of the soldier's son. In 2000, that mosaic and a cabinet identified as belonging to the room were formally returned to Russia. These are the only recovered fragments of the original. Subsequent investigations led to divergent theories that the crates were loaded onto the Wilhelm Gustloff ship, which departed from Gdynia in January 1945 and was torpedoed by a Soviet submarine. The remains of the ship have been explored without finding any evidence of amber, that they are buried in an underground bunker in Mamerki in northeastern Poland, where local testimonies indicated trucks unloading large crates at the end of the war, that they survived in salt mines near the Czech border, or that they never left the basement of Königsberg Castle, which the Soviet government demolished in 1968, thereby eliminating any possibility of on-site archaeological investigation. In 1979, the Soviet Union decided to build a replica. Russian craftsmen worked for more than 2 decades using old photographs and original plans. The German government provided funding when the Russian budget ran out. It was the German energy company E.ON that financed the final stage. In 2003, President Vladimir Putin and Chancellor Gerhard Schröder inaugurated the reconstructed room at the Catherine Palace. The researcher Georg Stein, a former German soldier who spent decades searching for the original amber and managed to recover other stolen objects during the war, was found dead in a Bavarian forest in 1987. He was naked, and his abdomen had been opened with a scalpel. The circumstances were never clarified. General Yuri Gusev, deputy director of the GRU, Russian military intelligence, died in a car accident in 1992, shortly after being identified as a source by a journalist investigating the Amber Room. His colleagues publicly dismissed that the accident was accidental. What began as a diplomatic gift between 2 European monarchies ended up being one of the most sought-after, most dangerous to track, and possibly most destroyed objects of World War II. The reconstruction exists. The original almost certainly does not. The imperial jewels and the treasure of Quedlinburg. The relics Hitler considered his own. Inside the bunker excavated beneath the sandstone rock of the medieval fortress of Nuremberg, in a reinforced chamber that Himmler had ordered to be built in anticipation of the Allied invasion, there was a red leather box resting on a velvet cushion. Inside that box lay a Roman spearhead. Around it, in carefully labeled drawers, were the crown of the Holy Roman Empire, covered with uncut sapphires, rubies, and amethysts, a silver scepter, a golden orb topped with a jeweled cross, a medieval sword with the word Mauritius engraved on its scabbard, an imperial cloak embroidered with camels and lions in pearls. 32 pieces in total, the Reichskleinodien, the imperial jewels of the Holy Roman Empire, which Hitler considered the symbolic heart of his Third Reich and the direct continuation of the Germanic heritage. The story of how these pieces came to this bunker begins in the Hofburg Palace in Vienna, where they had rested since Baron von Hugel sold them to the Habsburgs at the end of the 18th century. After the Anschluss in March 1938, Hitler claimed them as German heritage. On August 29th of that year, the armored train carrying the Lance of Longinus also transported the entirety of the imperial jewels to Nuremberg, a city Hitler called the soul of the Nazi Party and considered the spiritual headquarters of the Reich. The mayor of Nuremberg, Willy Liebel, received the pieces with military honors. The imperial jewels had a history of over 1,000 years. The crown had been used in the coronations of the emperors of the Holy Roman Empire since the 10th century, including Otto I, Frederick Barbarossa, and, according to tradition, Charles V. The sword of St. Maurice, named after the 3rd century Roman martyr, had accompanied coronations for 8 centuries. The orb and scepter represented the 2 powers of the emperor, the spiritual and the temporal. For Hitler, possessing these objects was not archaeology or collecting. It was a declaration of dynastic legitimacy, the Third Reich as the direct heir to the power of the Germanic Empire. When Allied bombings intensified attacks on Nuremberg in 1944, the jewels were moved to the underground bunker that Himmler had ordered to be excavated beneath the castle. The entrance was camouflaged as the garage of an antique shop in an alley of the historic center, with a sign that simply read "Antiques, New and Used." No one passing by suspected what lay behind. When the 7th Army of the United States took Nuremberg in April 1945, Lieutenant Walter William Horn, a German-born art historian who had taught at the University of California in Berkeley before the war, was assigned to locate the treasure. Horn spoke German fluently and methodically pressured the German municipal officials who knew its location. One of them, a man named Huber, finally spoke. Horn found the bunker, the reinforced chamber, and the 32 intact pieces. Among them, 5 were missing. The investigation into the 5 missing pieces, all central to the imperial coronation ceremony, took months and was personally ordered by General Dwight D. Eisenhower, who understood that these objects in the wrong hands could become the symbol of a Nazi revival. The search led Horn to trace post-war Teutonic Knights networks that guarded hidden treasures. The 5 pieces were eventually recovered. The complete treasure was returned to Vienna, where it can now be visited in the Imperial Treasury Room of the Hofburg Palace, exactly where it had been before Hitler stole it. But the imperial objects were not the only items the SS turned into tools for their ideology. 80 kilometers north of Quedlinburg, in the foothills of the Harz Mountains, there had existed since the 10th century the Abbey of Quedlinburg and its collegiate church of St. Servatius, founded by Otto I the Great in 936 as a memorial to his father, Henry the Fowler. That church housed what UNESCO would later describe as the most valuable medieval ecclesiastical treasure in Europe after Aachen and Halberstadt. Illuminated manuscripts from the 9th century with jeweled covers, reliquaries from the time of Charles the Bald, a gospel book with gold and silver inlays, and a 10th century ivory liturgical comb. For Himmler, Quedlinburg was more than just an artistic treasure. Henry the Fowler, whose tomb rested in the church's crypt, was his personal figure of veneration, the first unified German king, whom Himmler believed to be his direct reincarnation and whose spirit he consulted during his solitary visits to the tomb. Starting in 1936, the 1000th anniversary of Henry's death, Himmler turned the church into an SS sanctuary. Christian symbols were removed. Sigrunes, the eagle, and the swastika replaced them. Every July 2nd, the anniversary of the king's death, Himmler personally led a ceremony in the crypt that blended pagan ritual with political liturgy. In 1942, when Allied bombings began threatening German cities, the church's custodians moved the treasure to a mine in the Harz Mountains, southwest of Quedlinburg, to protect it. On April 19, 1945, troops from the 87th Armored Field Artillery Battalion of the United States Army occupied the area and took custody of the mine. A month later, church officials discovered that 12 of the most valuable pieces had disappeared. The culprit was Lieutenant Joe Tom Meader, a Texan with a background in fine arts who had used his knowledge to select exactly the most valuable pieces before his unit withdrew in July 1945. He sent them one by one in postal packages to his parents in Whitewright, Texas. In one of the accompanying letters, he described one of the gospel book covers as possibly pure gold with emeralds, jade, and pearls. Meader died in 1980 without ever being prosecuted. His brother, Jack, began using the pieces as collateral at a local Texas bank in the 1980s. In June 1990, the New York Times revealed the thief's name. The ensuing legal dispute concluded in 1992 with a settlement in which Meader's heirs received $912,500 as part of a total resolution of $2.75 million, and most of the pieces were returned to the Quedlinburg Church in 1993. 2 pieces remain missing to this day. The Quedlinburg treasure starkly illustrates one of the most consistent patterns of the post-war period. The objects that the Nazis ideologized and the Allies failed to safeguard properly ended up scattered among soldiers, collectors, and heirs who for decades either ignored or chose to ignore their provenance. The bust of Nefertiti, the Queen Hitler, refused to return. On December 6, 1912, the German archaeologist Ludwig Borchardt was excavating in Amarna, the ancient capital of Pharaoh Akhenaten, when one of his workers detected something different in the rubble of what had been the royal sculptor Thutmose's workshop, a flesh-colored neck protruding from the sand. The excavators set aside their tools and, with their hands, carefully extracted the object centimeter by centimeter. What emerged was a limestone bust covered in stucco paint, 50 centimeters tall and weighing approximately 20 kilograms. The royal blue headband was intact. The right eye, set with quartz and painted with a black iris, was still in place. The left eye had never been placed. The bust was unfinished when the workshop was abandoned. It was the portrait of Nefertiti, the great royal wife of Pharaoh Akhenaten, dated around 1345 BC. In his personal notes from that afternoon, Borchardt wrote a single phrase: "The description is useless, it must be seen." Then he made a deliberate decision. When presenting the findings to the Egyptian inspector Gustave Lefebvre for the legal distribution of pieces between the archaeological mission and the Egyptian state, Borchardt chose a photograph of the bust taken from an angle that hid its quality and catalogued it in the exchange list alongside lesser plaster sculptures. The bust was wrapped up and placed in a box when Lefebvre came to inspect it. Years later, Borchardt's personal letters to his German sponsors would reveal that he had acted intentionally. He warned his sponsors not to speak about the findings until they were safely out of Egypt, because if the Egyptians learned about the magnificent artifacts, they might want to keep them. The bust left Egypt classified as a minor and unremarkable piece. The mission was funded by the Berlin businessman and collector James Simon, who in 1920 donated the bust along with the rest of the Amarna findings to the Berlin State Museums. Nefertiti was first publicly displayed in January 1924 at the Neues Museum on Museum Island, and it immediately caused a cultural explosion. The German press made her a national symbol. In 1930, Berlin newspapers described her as the new monarch of Germany, personifying her as a queen who would restore the German imperial national identity after the humiliation of 1918. Kaiser Wilhelm II, already in his Dutch exile, requested and received a replica. The controversy over restitution began almost immediately. In 1925, the French authorities managing the Egyptian Antiquities Service initiated formal negotiations to recover the piece. German public opinion, fueled by nationalist press that had only been displaying Nefertiti as a symbol of Germanic greatness for a year, blocked any agreement. The bust remained in Berlin. When the Nazis came to power in 1933, Germany's stance on Nefertiti became explicit and unyielding. Hermann Göring, the second in command of the Reich, tried to use the return of the bust as a diplomatic gesture toward Egypt within the context of Germany's geopolitical interests in North Africa. Hitler personally blocked it. In one of the most documented statements about his relationship with the piece, the Führer declared, "I will never give up the head of the Queen." He described the bust on another occasion as a unique masterpiece, an ornament, a true treasure. The refusal was not just aesthetic, it was political. Nefertiti was, within the Nazi narrative, a symbol of the cultural superiority of the Germanic race over the rest of the world. The fact that the object was Egyptian was a detail that the Reich's ideology knew how to conveniently ignore. When Allied bombings began to seriously threaten Berlin, the regime acted with the same logic it applied to the Spear of Destiny or the imperial jewels. Objects that Hitler considered his own had to survive the war under his custody. In 1939, the Neues Museum closed its doors to the public. The artifacts were evacuated in successive waves. Nefertiti was first moved to the basement of the Prussian government bank, where she was stored in conditions of temperature and humidity that were not ideal for preserving the stucco. In the fall of 1941, she was transferred to the tower of an air raid shelter in Berlin. When the Royal Air Force bombed the Neues Museum in 1943 and reduced much of the building to rubble, the Queen was no longer there. On March 6, 1945, with Soviet troops advancing on Berlin and the city in a state of collapse, the bust was moved for the final time under Nazi custody to a salt mine in Merkers-Kieselbach in Thuringia, about 300 kilometers southwest of Berlin. The same mine that was discovered by soldiers of the Third U.S. Army on April 8, 1945, and which, in addition to the bust, contained 250 tons of gold reserves from the Reichsbank, thousands of banknotes from various European currencies, and hundreds of works of art. General George S. Patton personally inspected the mine on April 12, 1945. According to reports from the monument's men who catalogued the contents, Nefertiti was stored in a plastic bag inside her transport box. The object that Hitler considered one of the Reich's most valuable possessions had survived the war in packing conditions that any museum curator would have deemed inadequate. The U.S. troops moved the bust to Wiesbaden in the American occupation zone, where it was exhibited to the public in 1946. When Berlin was divided by the wall in 1961, Nefertiti was in the western sector. She was displayed at the Egyptian Museum in the Charlottenburg district, starting in 1967. In 1991, after German reunification, years of temporary moves between different museum spaces in Berlin began. In 2009, when British architect David Chipperfield completed the reconstruction of the newest museum, a €295 million process that took 6 years and meticulously respected the scars of the bombed building, Nefertiti returned to the room where she had been first exhibited in 1924. Today, she rests in a bulletproof glass case in a dimly lit room on the museum's north floor. It is the most visited object in Berlin and one of the 10 most visited in the world. Egypt has never stopped claiming it. The archaeologist Zahi Hawass, former Egyptian Minister of Antiquities, made the restitution of the bust a personal cause for decades. In 2007, the then director of the Neues Museum, Dietrich Wildung, temporarily loaned a silicone replica of Nefertiti to an exhibition at the Grand Palais in Paris in a context that mixed the original bust with contemporary art. Egyptian officials reacted with formal diplomatic outrage. The Minister of Culture, Farouk Hosni, publicly declared that Nefertiti was not in good hands. Wildung and his wife were banned from excavating in Egypt. The Prussian Cultural Heritage Foundation, which manages the Neues Museum, maintains an unwavering position. The bust was obtained legally under the distribution rules for discoveries that were in place in 1912. What those rules do not state, but contemporary historiography does point out, is that they only existed because Egypt was under British colonial control and lacked true sovereignty over its own heritage. German historian Sebastian Conrad, author of The Making of a Global Icon, summed up the argument precisely. It was legal at the time, but not legitimate from the current perspective. What makes Nefertiti's case unique in the history of Nazi looting is not that Hitler stole her. The bust was already in Berlin when he came to power, but that he chose to protect her as if she were his own, to deny her as diplomatic bargaining power, and to risk military resources to evacuate her while Berlin was burning. In the hierarchy of what the Reich considered irreplaceable, a 3,300-year-old Egyptian queen occupied a position as high as the jewels of the German emperors. That choice says more about the nature of the regime than any decree or speech. The power that claimed to represent the purity of the Aryan race found in a queen from North Africa the image that best embodied their notion of beauty and grandeur. And it refused to let go of her until the very last day. Hitler's Mercedes. The throne on wheels that no one wanted to show. There is an image that repeated itself for 12 years with an almost hypnotic regularity. A black car slowly moving down a boulevard flanked by flags while tens of thousands of arms stretched upward. The vehicle was not a logistical detail of Nazi protocol. It was the centerpiece of a visual grammar designed to turn movement into power, speed into domination, and the public appearance of a man into a political ritual without equal in modern history. The Mercedes-Benz 770, known in German as the Große Mercedes or Grand Mercedes, was conceived from its inception as a state vehicle. Its dimensions said it all: 6 meters in length, an imposing height when stationary, and a 7.7-liter supercharged engine capable of exceeding 160 kilometers per hour. It was so expensive that its price didn't even appear in the brand's catalog. A total of 88 units of the model were produced between 1930 and 1943, of which an unspecified number were acquired or requisitioned for Nazi use. The convertible version was the one Hitler used in parades. It allowed him to stand, visible from any point in the crowd, at a height that no man on the ground could reach without infrastructure. Every urban journey was choreographed. Reduced speed, calculated escort distance, and the leader's position fixed in the center of the frame. The car did not transport Hitler, it exhibited him. The difference is not semantic, it is the difference between a means of transportation and a mobile stage. But beneath the elegant bodywork operated a logic that contradicted the spectacle: fear. The armored versions of the 770 incorporated 18mm steel plates throughout the body, an additional 11mm plate at the base designed to withstand a 500-gram dynamite explosion, 12-centimeter thick doors weighing 150 kilograms each, the equivalent of 8 conventional doors, and 4.5-centimeter thick laminated glass windows, bulletproof. Each technical solution was the material response to a real threat. The regime knew exactly how many people in Germany and the occupied territories wanted to kill their leader. The central paradox of the vehicle was that its propagandistic use made it vulnerable. In parades, Hitler stood erect above the waist, out of the effective reach of any armor. Security gave way to theatricality whenever the spectacle demanded it. The car was simultaneously a fortress and a showcase, and that contradiction was not a design flaw but a synthesis of the entire system. There was also the Mercedes-Benz 540 G4, a 6-wheeled, 3-axle, all-terrain vehicle used for visits to the front, military inspections, and tours of newly occupied territories. Its purpose was not ceremonial in the same way as the 770, but its presence in difficult terrain conveyed the same message. German engineering advanced without being stopped by any geographical obstacle. In early May 1945, a squad from the 20th Armored Regiment of the United States Army, led by Sergeant Joe Azara, located a convoy with several Reich vehicles at a railway siding in the town of Laufen, north of Salzburg, Austria. Among them was a Mercedes 770 convertible. After a brief exchange of fire with the last German troops guarding the site, the vehicle was captured and inventoried as a war trophy. What followed for decades was a story of confused identities that turned the car into an enigma within an enigma. In various Allied records, the same vehicle was attributed to Hermann Göring, General Heinrich von Kleist, and other Reich officials. The confusion was not casual. In the immediate post-war period, there was no institutional interest in preserving the exact identity of the enemy's symbols. Vehicles were catalogued with the urgency of managing war trophies, not with the precision of those documenting history. Decades later, when researchers began cross-referencing chassis numbers with Daimler-Benz manufacturing records and files from the Chancellery, the picture became clearer. A detailed examination of the license plate that had remained on the vehicle revealed Hitler's personal registration number. With the assistance of the West German embassy, it was confirmed that the car had specifically belonged to Hitler and had been used at the Chancellery. What had been presented for years as Göring's car was, in fact, the Führer's own car. This correction raised questions that were never fully answered. If the identity of the vehicle had remained incorrect for so long in institutional records, how many other objects of the Reich circulated with incorrect attributions? And how many had disappeared into the private market precisely because the documentary imprecision made it easier? From the 1970s onward, the trail of the most famous Mercedes veered into the international auction circuit for historical collectibles. The car was listed with prices ranging from several to tens of millions of dollars. In some cases, the sale did not go through. In others, the results remained surrounded by ambiguous statements. When names of potential buyers emerged, including references to international magnates and an unidentified Russian buyer, at least one of the named individuals publicly denied being the owner. That denial cleared nothing up. The opacity of the private market for historically compromised objects works exactly like that. The harder it is to exhibit them without consequences, the more valuable discrete ownership becomes. Today, there exists a Mercedes 770K linked to Hitler that can be visited at the Canadian War Museum in Ottawa, Canada, acquired by the Canadian government after the war. Another is at the National Museum of Military History in Diekirch, Luxembourg. And there is at least one more whose exact whereabouts are not documented in any public record. The vehicle that for 12 years was the stage for the liturgy of Nazi power ended up becoming uncomfortable merchandise. Desired by collectors who cannot exhibit it, feared by institutions that do not want to justify it, and surrounded by a silence that is, in itself, the most effective form of possession for an object whose history weighs more than its metal. The SS, rings, and the objects of Wuhlsburg, the loot that was dispersed. In the fall of 1944, with the Eastern and Western fronts closing in on the Reich, Himmler ordered that all SS honor rings that had been returned to Wuhlsburg Castle after the death of their bearers be destroyed. The order was partially carried out. Some of the rings were melted down or buried. Exactly how many and where is something the SS records do not clarify because the records themselves were destroyed. The SS honor ring, the Ehrenring or Totenkopf ring, was the most symbolic personal object within the ceremonial apparatus of the Reich. It was not a rank or an award, it was an admission. Himmler personally gave it to members he considered worthy of belonging to the SS elite, and when a bearer died, the ring was to be returned to Wewelsburg, where Himmler kept it as if each ring were an extension of the spirit of the deceased, deposited in the castle forever. The design of the ring was invariable, solid silver with a skull in the center. The Totenkopf, a symbol of loyalty unto death, Hörgal runes on the sides, a double Sig rune, and a swastika. Inside, engraved, the name of the bearer, the date of delivery, and Himmler's signature. Between 1933 and 1945, approximately 14,500 rings were manufactured, according to the records of the manufacturer Karl Diebitsch, the official designer of the object for the SS. Of those 14,500, historical research has been able to locate with certainty fewer than 400. The whereabouts of the remaining rings is one of the most active questions in the German military antiques market. The rings regularly appear in auction houses in Europe and North America, with prices ranging from 30,000 to 100,000 euros per piece depending on their condition, the prominence of the original bearer, and available documentation. Authenticity is difficult to verify. The number of forgeries in circulation is, according to market specialists, at least equal to that of genuine pieces. Wewelsburg was not only the repository of the rings, it was the place where a collection of archaeological, artistic, and ritual objects accumulated by the Ahnenerbe and the SS over the years was stored in libraries and display cases. Books on mythology from dozens of cultures, medieval manuscripts, Germanic ritual objects, pieces from excavations in Hedeby, Olympia, and Bohuslän, photographs and records from expeditions to Tibet, Finland, and Sweden. The exact inventory of this collection was never completed because on March 31st, 1945, when the German troops partially blew up the North Tower and abandoned the castle, much of that material was removed, dispersed, or destroyed in the chaos of the final days. What did survive was recovered in fragmentary form by the American troops of the Third Army, who entered Buren on April 2nd, 1945. Among the objects found on site were documents from the internal administration of the SS, some library materials, and ceremonial furniture. But the objects of greatest symbolic value, the rings kept in the castle, the ritual instruments from the Black Sun Room, the objects from the Grail Room, were not found. They had been evacuated, destroyed, or hidden in an unknown radius around the castle. Since 1977, the Wewelsburg Museum has recovered and publicly displayed part of that history, but the recovery has necessarily been incomplete. Research conducted by the museum in the following decades found indications that at least part of the castle's contents were buried in the surrounding forests or moved to locations in Bavaria before the surrender. None of these locations have been archaeologically confirmed. The rings that have been located tell individual stories that the collective apparatus of Nazism tended to erase. The ring of Reinhard Heydrich, head of the SD, architect of the Holocaust, assassinated in Prague on June 4, 1942, after the assassination attempt carried out by Czech paratroopers Josef Gabčík and Jan Kubis, was returned to Wewelsburg according to the established protocol. Its current whereabouts are unknown. The ring of Ernst Röhm, head of the SA, executed during the Night of the Long Knives in July 1934, has also not been located. That of Rudolf Hess, who fled to Scotland in May 1941 on an unauthorized flight and was imprisoned in Britain until his death in Spandau Prison in 1987, is in private hands according to the latest available information, although there has been no public confirmation of its owner. The dispersal of the objects from Wewelsburg is, at its core, the material reflection of what happened to the entire ideology that produced them. It did not disappear with defeat. It fragmented, it was hidden, it passed into private hands, and it survived in small objects that circulate among people who prefer not to explain how they came to possess them. In the basements of some collectors' homes in Germany, Austria, Argentina, and the United States, there are objects that belong to the castle that Himmler called the navel of the world. They are not in museums. They are not documented in public records. They are in boxes, in private display cases, in rooms that no one shows. And that, for the researchers who have been searching for them for decades, is just as unsettling as their disappearance. The Portrait of a Young Man by Raphael, the work that no one has found. In September 1939, when German armored divisions crossed the Polish border and began the systematic occupation of the country, one of the first cultural objectives identified by the Nazi looting teams was the Czartoryski Museum in Krakow. The museum housed 3 works of historical significance that the catalogers of the Einsatzstab Reichsleiter Rosenberg, the cultural confiscation organization led by Nazi ideologue Alfred Rosenberg, had marked as priorities: Landscape with the Good News by Rembrandt, Lady with an Ermine by Leonardo da Vinci, and Portrait of a Young Man by Raphael Sanzio. All 3 were confiscated. All 3 ended up in the hands of Hans Frank, the German lawyer whom Hitler appointed as Governor-General of occupied Poland, who set up his headquarters in the Wawel Castle in Krakow, transforming one of the jewels of the Polish Renaissance into his personal residence. Frank hung the Leonardo and the Raphael in his office and private salons. In the following years, the paintings traveled with Frank between Berlin, Dresden, Linz, and back to Krakow, following the ebb and flow of the front and the Governor-General's movements. When American troops arrested Hans Frank in May 1945 at Wawel Castle, they found the Leonardo by Da Vinci. They also found the Rembrandt. The Portrait of a Young Man by Raphael was not there. No document indicating its whereabouts was found with Frank. The painting had disappeared at some point between the fall of 1944 and the spring of 1945 in the chaos of the German retreat. Lady with an Ermine was returned to Poland in 1946 and is now displayed at the National Museum in Krakow. The Raphael has not appeared in any known inventory, any documented auction, or any verified private collection since 1945. The work in question was a portrait of a young man between 20 and 25 years old, set against a black background, wearing Renaissance Italian attire. It was painted by Raphael between 1513 and 1514 during his stay in Rome. Art historians identify it as one of the most accomplished portraits of the artist's late period, comparable in technique and psychological composition to the great portraits in the Uffizi collection. Its exact dimensions are 72 by 56 centimeters. It belonged to the Czartoryski family since the late 18th century, when it was acquired in Italy by Prince Adam Kazimierz Czartoryski. The FBI includes it in its list of the most wanted works of art in the world. The Polish Ministry of Culture has kept the search active continuously since 1945. In 2012, German historian Arthur Brand, a specialist in recovering stolen art, claimed to have indications that the painting was in the hands of a European private collector. In 2019, a report commissioned by the Polish government concluded that the work was possibly destroyed during bombings or the fire of a German warehouse at the end of the war. This conclusion has not been universally accepted. The story of the Raphael illustrates a dimension of Nazi looting that is often overshadowed by religious relics, the systematic theft of European Renaissance art, not as an impulsive act by soldiers on campaign, but as a state-planned policy, executed by specialists with pre-made lists. The Kümmel report, compiled in 1940 by German art historian Otto Kümmel at the direct request of Joseph Goebbels, listed tens of thousands of works of art of supposedly German origin that were to be repatriated from museums across Europe. The Raphael from Krakow was not on that list. It was simply taken because it was available and because Hans Frank liked it. The contrast between these two looting logics, the ideological and the personal, explains why the recovery of art stolen by the Nazis remains active in the 21st century. According to the Commission for Stolen Art in Europe, it is estimated that between 1933 and 1945, the Nazis confiscated or stole approximately 600,000 pieces of art across Europe. Of these, more than 100,000 remain unlocated. Raphael's portrait of a young man is the most famous of these missing works, but it is far from the only one. Wewelsburg Castle, the spiritual center of the New Order. There is a triangle in Westphalia that Himmler chose as the navel of the world. It was not an important city, nor a strategic node, nor an obvious historical symbol. It was a ruined medieval castle in the small town of Büren, south of Paderborn, Wewelsburg Castle. In 1934, Himmler requisitioned it from the Paderborn diocese. The annual rent agreed upon was 1 German mark. The choice was not arbitrary. The occultist Karl Maria Willigut, who became a brigade Führer of the SS and Himmler's spiritual mentor, pointed to Wewelsburg as the place where, according to his prophecies, which Himmler took as transmissions from ancient Germanic times, the ceremonial headquarters of the SS should be established. Willigut claimed to descend from a sacred line of Germanic king priests and asserted that he could remember events that occurred 12,000 years ago. Himmler listened to him as if he were an oracle. The castle has a triangular shape, 2 towers oriented to the south and 1 to the north. Himmler chose the southwest tower for his personal use. The southeast tower was designated for Hitler, decorated with a special library and paintings, although there is no documented evidence that Hitler visited the site more than once or twice, if he ever did. The side and southern wings housed thousands of books on the mythology of the world's peoples, along with archaeological and artistic objects, many of them looted from occupied territories. The most radical reconstruction affected the North Tower. It was completely rebuilt under the supervision of architect Hermann Bartels. Inside, 3 ceremonial floors were built that had no equivalent in any other building of the Third Reich. The lower floor is a circular room whose vault displays a swastika with extended arms. In the center of the floor, there is a shallow pit surrounded by a stone wall, with remnants of what may have been a gas pipeline to keep a permanent flame lit. 12 thrones surround this pit. The most accepted version by researchers suggests that this is where the personalized silver rings, which Himmler gave to the high-ranking SS officers and retrieved upon their death, were kept. The middle floor, called the Hall of the Senior Generals, a rank reserved exclusively for those Himmler personally designated, has 12 Sig runes arranged in a circle in the center of its floor, forming a solar wheel, the Sonnenrad, which the Nazis interpreted as the Black Sun or Schwarze Sonne. According to Walter Schellenberg, an SS intelligence officer who described the room in his post-war memoirs, ceremonies with fire, torch processions, and invocations to Teutonic gods with selected individuals were held in that space. At times, a gold disc was placed in the center of the Black Sun. and participants arranged themselves around it to perform prayers intended to establish a connection between the black sun on the floor and the swastika engraved in the vault of the lower floor, which was symbolically considered the underworld. The upper floor was never completed. It was designed to be covered by a tall dome that would have made the North Tower the most visible point of the complex. The war prevented this. The surroundings of the castle were also never finished. The plans created by Himmler's office showed a network of residential and educational buildings intended for the chosen members of the SS, with the castle at the tip of a formation that, when viewed from above, resembled the point of a spear aimed north. The project was definitively cancelled with the Allied advance in 1945. On March 31st of that year, the SS partially blew up the North Tower before abandoning the castle. The exact reasons were never clarified. It may have been to prevent the Allies from documenting what had occurred there, or simply the chaos of defeat. The books, objects, and records inside were scattered. Some were recovered later, the rest disappeared. Since 1977, the castle has housed the Wawelsburg Museum. Its collections document the history of the place under the SS and the history of the victims of the Niederhagen concentration camp, built between 1941 and 1943, just 2 kilometers from the castle, to provide slave labor for the reconstruction works. Of the 3,900 prisoners who passed through the camp, more than 1,200 died. The place that Himmler designed as the spiritual center of a superior race was built on the bones of those whom that regime considered expendable. This paradox requires no further comment. The archive that survived: how the monument's men changed the history of relics. On August 12, 1944, in a salt mine 400 meters deep beneath the hills of Altaussee, in the Salzkammergut Lake region of Austria, mine workers found something they weren't expecting: 7 large sealed wooden crates, placed there by order of the SS. Inside were 137 paintings, including The Adoration of the Mystic Lamb from Ghent, the Polyptych by Jan van Eyck, considered the most influential painting in the history of Western art, measuring 3.5 by 4.4 meters and weighing approximately 2 tons. It was the object that Hitler, according to later documentation, had desired most intensely of all the things he tried to possess. The Altaussee mine was the most important repository in the Nazi system of storing stolen art, built in the final years of the war. Tunnels dug in dry salt, with a stable temperature of 8 degrees and naturally controlled humidity, proved to be the ideal environment for preserving oil paintings, sculptures, tapestries, and manuscripts. Altaussee stored the 12,000 most valuable pieces of the Reich's European loot, destined for the Führer Museum, the museum that Hitler planned to build in Linz, his hometown in Austria, which would have concentrated all the important works of world art. The project had a name, plans drawn by architect Roderick Fick, and an inventory of more than 8,000 specific pieces identified for acquisition, either voluntarily or forcibly. The recovery of this treasure was made possible by an initiative that began in August 1943, when President Franklin D. Roosevelt approved the creation of the Commission for the Protection and Salvage of Artistic and Historical Monuments in War Areas, popularly known as the Monuments Men. The unit was composed of 465 men and women, art historians, architects, curators, archaeologists, and conservators from 13 Allied countries. Their mission was to locate, protect, and recover Europe's cultural heritage in combat zones. They worked under extreme conditions. None of them had significant military rank. Their requests for transport, fuel, and personnel were systematically relegated to lower priority compared to the operational needs of field commanders. However, between 1944 and 1951, they managed to locate and recover more than 5 million objects of art stolen or hidden by the Nazis. The storage system they discovered was of a scale that even the investigators took weeks to fully understand. In addition to Altaussee, the Monuments Men located deposits in over 1,000 locations across Germany, Austria, and occupied territories. Salt mines in Merkers, where on April 8, 1945, they found 250 tons of Reichsbank gold reserves, along with thousands of works of art. Bavarian castles like Neuschwanstein and Herrenchiemsee, monasteries, school basements, and tunnels beneath medieval cities. Lieutenant Robert Posey and Private Lincoln Kirstein, the latter one of the founders of ballet in the United States, located the Altaussee deposit thanks to a chance visit to a dentist who turned out to be a former SS officer with information about the hideout. The discovery of Altersee came just days before the Nazi Gauleiter of the region, August Eigruber, ordered explosives to be placed inside the mine to destroy its contents before they fell into Allied hands. The crates that the mine workers found in August 1944 contained, within the painting crates, 500-kilogram bombs marked as Carrara marble. The Austrian miners themselves, without military support, deactivated the explosives and sealed the mine before the American soldiers arrived. It was one of the most significant and least documented acts of civil resistance during the war. The Ghent polyptych was returned to St. Bavo's Cathedral in Ghent, Belgium, on September 3, 1945. Its lower left side panel, the Just Judges, which had been stolen from the cathedral in 1934, even before the war, in a robbery that was never solved, remains missing. It is the only panel of the polyptych that has not been located. The work of the monument's men set the legal and logistical precedent for everything that came after. The 1954 Hague Convention on the Protection of Cultural Property in the event of armed conflict was directly inspired by the lessons learned during the recovery of Nazi-looted heritage. The Commission for Stolen Art in Europe, founded in 1999, and restitution laws that today allow heirs of Holocaust victims to claim works sold under duress, exist because the monument's men meticulously documented what they found. Of the 5 million objects recovered, 3.5 million were returned to their countries of origin. The rest remained in Allied country repositories while property disputes were resolved, some of which remain active in European and US courts in 2026. In 2009, the German government created the Lost Art database, which records more than 100,000 cultural objects stolen during the Nazi era that have not yet been returned to their rightful owners or heirs. What the relics and art stolen by the Reich reveal 70 years later is not just the ambition of a regime or the megalomania of its leaders. It is the fragility with which civilizations preserve what they consider sacred, and the tenacity with which some people, armed only with knowledge and documentation, can recover it when the power that stole it has ceased to exist. That is perhaps the only story with an ending in this documentary. Everything else remains open.